Hi, in this lesson we're going to talk about adverse possession and encroachments. In another lesson we talked about a prescriptive easement where over a long period of time by crossing somebody else's property without their permission that you could actually acquire an easement across their property. Well, in this lesson we're going to talk about adverse possession. Some people call that squatter's rights. In order for someone to acquire ownership of property under adverse possession, I want you to remember this acronym NOTCH, N-O-C-H, which stands for Notorious, Open, Continuous, and Hostile Possession. So first and foremost, notorious along with open. Notorious means with some notoriety, so that it's being done openly in full view of the world. They kind of go hand in hand. Continuous means on a regular basis. So in the case of a prescriptive easement like we talked about, the use of that easement would have to be regular. With adverse possession to acquire ownership, it would have to be basically continuous. In fact, let's take a real simple example. Let's say that I built a block wall on my property, at least I thought it was on my property, but it was actually encroaching 15 feet onto your property. And over a long period of time, you never came to me and said, Jim, you're on my property, you need to get off. And I continue to utilize that property, maintain it, and so on. And eventually, over a long enough period of time, and in Arizona it's a minimum of 10 years, I could actually be able to acquire ownership of that property if I tried to make a claim. The concept of hostile goes right along with the term adverse possession. If I gave you permission to use my property, then your use is not hostile. So these four elements, notorious, open, continuous, and hostile possession, must be there in order for someone to acquire ownership under adverse possession. Now, how would you prevent adverse possession from occurring if you knew someone was using your property? Well, remember in a previous lesson we talked about this prescriptive easement where the kids were crossing your property in order to get a shortcut to go to school? Well, let's take that situation and let's say you recognize the kids were crossing your property. So one of the things you could do would be to give permission. Give permission to the kids or give permission really to the public. And that's actually done pretty commonly where an owner knows that the public is using the property. Oftentimes they post the property and say permission to use can be revoked at any time. Another way is to interrupt the continuity. So let's say that you recognize the kids were crossing the property, and every so often, maybe once a year, you simply stopped them from crossing the property and told them they had to go around. There's a really good example of this in New York City in Rockefeller Center. Back in my college days, I actually worked right around the corner from Rockefeller Center, and once a year or so, they would actually rope off Rockefeller Center and put signs there and hire some security guards, and they would tell people that they had to walk around. They couldn't cross through Rockefeller Center. Well, some people actually skipped over the rope or the chain that was there, but the idea was that they were exercising their ownership over the property, interrupting the continuity, and preventing the possibility of a prescriptive easement. So, if I had built that block wall onto your property, then how could you prevent me from acquiring ownership of that property over a long period of time? Well, simple way is to give me permission, maybe lease the property to me. Interrupting the continuity, pretty difficult to do simply because of the fact that I'm actually using that property and I've got a block wall. So in that circumstance, probably the best way would be to give me permission. So that's a little bit on adverse possession. And there's a slight difference between adverse possession and prescriptive or prescription relative to easements. The term prescription applies to easements, where adverse possession actually applies to acquiring ownership of the whole property. Now, let's make a distinction between an easement, what we talked about in another lesson, and an encroachment. An encroachment is actually the physical trespass of some improvement onto a neighboring property. As I mentioned, when I built that block wall 15 feet into your property, I would be encroaching on your property. But an encroachment could actually eventually turn into ownership under adverse possession. So here's an example of an encroachment. Now, if you look at this picture where you see that furniture store there, it looks like that furniture store is probably built right on the property line, so that shed there is probably encroaching on the neighboring property. By the way, the neighboring property there where those cars are is where our school is. So is that where the encroachment is? Well, the answer is no, it's not. The actual property line is right there. And in actual fact, my parking lot, where those cars are, actually encroaches into that neighboring property by 8 feet. Now, years ago, when we first moved to this location, we knew that that encroachment existed. And the way we resolved it was the owner of the furniture store actually leased that 8 feet to us, thus avoiding any potential for adverse possession. So that parking lot actually does encroach 8 feet onto the adjacent property. And you never want to tell people, well, the property line is here. If a buyer is interested in knowing where the property line is, you always, always, always want to suggest that they get a survey. So let's take a couple of situations here where D built a garage, but he built it partially onto S's property. The question I have for you, how could that encroachment be fixed? So think about that for a second. How could we eliminate the potential for adverse possession, which exists, right, even though there is an encroachment? Well, one way would be, right, to sell that land to D. So S could sell that little strip of property to D, and that would eliminate the potential for adverse possession because D owns the property. Another way would be for S to lease that land to D, and in that circumstance, the potential for adverse possession is eliminated. A third way would be for S to give D an easement across that property. And the fourth way, well, S could require D to remove it. Now, if D had built that there and S did not say anything to D, and over a long, long, long period of time, the use was there without permission, open, notorious, continuous, and hostile, or I should say notch, notorious, open, continuous, and hostile, then that could give rise to ownership of that piece of property where the garage was, right there, to D. So if you are not sure of where the property boundaries are, again, always make sure that the buyer of the property gets a survey done. So that's our discussion on adverse possession.